Hello, my friends. My name is Kevin Cosby, and I'm the pastor of St. Stephen Baptist Church, and I am the president of Simmons College of Kentucky, HBCU here in Louisville, Kentucky. The true test of character is not where a person stands during times of convenience, but the true test of character is a person's position during times of controversy. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that during the great Birmingham campaign to desegregate what was at the time in 1963 the most segregated city in America, what disturbed Dr. King, he said, was not the tragic brutality of bad people, but the silence of good people. Edmund Burke once said, Edmund Burke, that all that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to say nothing. I have been asked on several occasions and have been called by people in the media, what is your position concerning the current state of America and all of the social and civil unrest that we see exploding in our cities? And I would like to say that it burdens my heart with extreme pain to see what is taking place throughout our country, and more specifically, what is taking place here in my hometown of Louisville, Kentucky. I think it's critically important that this new generation of leadership that is bringing attention to the evils of systemic injustice and structural racism that has plagued this country from its inception and since the time that blacks first came onto these shores in August of 1619 to the British colonies, that for 400 years, the critical issues of racial injustice has never been adequately addressed are truthfully confronted in our society. The great James Baldwin was right when he said that you cannot fix what you refuse to face. And to be totally truthful, if we would search our hearts as Americans, we have not truly faced what is America's original sin and what the United Nations would definitely call crimes against humanity. I would like to, first of all, apologize to the millennials, to the Gen Xers, and especially to the millennials and the Generation Z, because my generation of black leadership has let your generation down. The reason what is taking place in our streets is happening is because we became, our generation, my generation, became too comfortable. The fact of the matter is that in the 60s, the reason why things changed was because, in the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, the talented 10th and black leadership used their strength and their influence to be advocates for those who were voiceless in our community. During the 60s, prominent, successful black people, from Ella Baker to Martin Luther King Jr., in the words of my good friend and colleague Antonio Moore, they used their influence for one thing, to create empathy for black pain and black suffering from those who were in power in our society. How did Martin Luther King Jr. die? Where did he die? He did not die in office, or he did not die the president of a prestigious university. He did not die because he had been given an appointment by the president of the United States. But this brilliant young 39-year-old minister with a PhD from Boston University took that PhD and put it on the altar of sacrifice to be a spokesperson and to create empathy for sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, who were being treated less than human. He helped to create, in the words of Antonio Moore, empathy for the least of those who are in our society. What made Muhammad Ali so great was not simply his exploits in the ring, but here was a young man tutored by Elijah Muhammad who used his power, his charisma, and his influence to be an advocate, to help create empathy for people in our society that had no voice. But something happened after Dr. King was assassinated and a new generation emerged. And the new generation, instead of helping to create empathy for suffering Black people, they instead engaged in a form of political correctness and political respectability for the sole purpose of positioning themselves as careerists and often abandoning the people who they should have been advocating for. So instead of following what previous generations had done, from Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, who used their privilege to create empathy for suffering people, we in my generation used our privilege to help engender in white America a sense of apathy, the false myth that America had moved to a post-racial society, that we had solved the issue of race. We have not solved the issue of race, and we will never solve the issue of race until we are willing to face the issue of race. My generation let you down, and for that, I am deeply troubled. I can only say that in my own life, I have dedicated my life to the best of my ability to try to be a voice for those who do not have a voice in the Black community. I am the pastor of a very prominent and successful church, but we never left the poorest zip code in the state of Kentucky, the California community, the 40210 zip code, which is the poorest zip code in Kentucky. Our church never left. And personally, my family never left the Black community in West Louisville. We live in West Louisville. We did not move out. I have lived in West Louisville all my adult life by choice. So the pains that you experience and the blows that hit you as a resident of your community, I know it because my family has always experienced it. We too shop at Kroger's at 28th and Broadway. I know what it means to have people coming up and saying, can you spare $1? Can you spare a quarter while I'm putting gas in my car? Because I get my gas like you get your gas at 28th and Broadway. I know what it's like to drive down Broadway and not have stores that you can go and get some food because I have to drive down Broadway to get home. I know what it's like to see on one corner Taco Bell, on another corner McDonald's, and cars that are chained and snaked around the building trying to get food. I know what it's like to have, when I'm in line, some non-mobile person coming to me and say, hey, bro, can you buy me something to eat? Or here, I'll give you the money. Can you order for me? I know what that's like. I have felt that because I live, move, and have my being right here in West Louisville, right here in the heart of the Black community. But having said that, I take responsibility as a member of my generation and challenge my generation to stop helping to give white America a false narrative about a post-racial America that has never existed. Quit being careerist. The fact of the matter is, we have abandoned Black people, not just whites, but the Black professional class. We've lost our institutions, the Black community for the most part, whether it's Louisville, whether it's Brunswick or whether it's Minneapolis. The fact of the matter is we have abandoned those communities. Segregation was awful. It was state mandated. That's why it was evil. It was evil because it was state mandated. However, in these black communities, we did have some fundamental basic institutions. We did have strong black churches and strong black schools and to some degree, some black businesses and some strong families. And we even had black media. But we have been deinstitutionalized. These urban areas do not have institutions that provide services for them as other communities have. We've been deinstitutionalized. We went from segregation to desegregation to integration to total disintegration. And that is what has happened in every urban area. And we think, oh my God, we have made progress as a country. I mean, after all, look, we have Michael Jordan. Everyone wants to be like Mike. Look, we have Oprah Winfrey. Look, we have President Obama. But Dr. King, in his last speech on April the 3rd, 1968, didn't say me as a people would get to the promised land. He said we as a people, we, the aggregate, the collective, would get to the promised land. Now here we are in a city, Louisville, Kentucky, one of the COVID-3 cities, Brunswick, Louisville, and Minneapolis. And we are one of those three cities that will remember, that history will remember because of the execution of Breonna Taylor. And it was an execution. It reminds me of what happened to Fred Hampton when COINTELPRO and the CIA and the FBI and the government conspired to suppress this brother's legitimate complaints and advocacy for justice. What they did to Fred Hampton back in the late 60s is the same thing that was done to Breonna Taylor. It was an execution. It was callous. It was mean. It was cold-blooded. And it reflected a philosophy that was made popular in 1857 by the United States Supreme Court and Chief Justice Roger Taney, who said that black men and black women have no rights that whites are bound to respect. And while the 13th Amendment may be repealed the Dred Scott decision from the law books, it has never repealed it from policies and in the hearts of those who are in power. Black people have no rights that black people have no rights that whites are bound to respect. In addition to that, I am greatly troubled by the death of David Yaya McAtee, a brilliant brother, a great businessman who was attempting to make a difference in our community. You have to be careful to quote one of my mentors, Sister Yvette Carnell, who says it's important how you frame a thing. And I would like to frame David Yaya McAtee. Now, the media is going to say, well, he was a rebel rouser. But those of us who knew him know that he was a businessman who was an exemplary model for our community and our neighborhood. And I would submit to you that he is our Crispus Attucks. You know, the first person to die for white liberation, because that's what the Revolutionary War was. The Revolutionary War was a war for white liberation. It was not a war for black liberation. But the first man to die for white American liberation was a black man, Crispus Attucks. And he was killed by the police, the National Guard of King George III and the British. Now, if you read King George III's history book, he will call Crispus Attucks a terrorist, a criminal. But in American history books, he is called a patriot and a hero. And he's called a patriot and a hero because he was dying for white liberation. So if you can call a man named Crispus Attucks, who was dying for your liberation, a hero, then black people have the right to call David Yaya McAtee, who was dying for black liberation, a hero as well. It's interesting that here in Louisville, Kentucky, we pride ourselves as being the Mecca of basketball. And we are the Mecca of basketball in the state of Kentucky because you have Simmons College and Kentucky State, and that's what makes us the Mecca of basketball in the state of Kentucky. But let's just suppose that the University of Louisville is having a basketball game and that Coach Chris Mack is playing against, the U of L is playing against UK. And let's just suppose that Chris Mack knows, well, you know what? The calls are imbalanced. The referees, who's supposed to be impartial, seems to be calling all the calls against University of Louisville, even when it is blatant that University of Louisville basketball players have been fouled or that UK's basketball team has committed an infraction. Can I tell you what Chris Mack would do? He would channel his Bobby Knight, and he would throw a chair out on the floor if it was just blatant disregard for fairness. He would become upset, and no doubt he would be kicked out of the game. But those who are U of L fans and those who knew basketball would say he was more than justified to be angry because there was not equity in the way things are called. And when there is not equity in the way that justice is called in the country, then people begin to throw things, not chairs, but they begin to throw bricks. They begin to throw things and they begin to destroy things because of the lack of equity. Now, if you can understand that illustration when it comes to basketball, how much more should it apply when it comes to the sacredness of human life, like Breonna Taylor and like David Yaya McAtee and so many other persons year after year after year who have been the victim of state-sponsored police murder. I would like to call for, as the president of an HBCU, as a pastor, and I can only speak for myself, but some radical changes need to be made right now, immediately, to send a message. And then long-term change, true change, not cosmetic change, but the kind of change that Dr. King was advocating for and the Kerner report called for, that was issued in 1968, the same type of radical change. I want to call for it. But there are some immediate things that we need to address. And our mayor needs to address them, who I consider to be a good friend. And that is, Chief Conrad needs to be fired as the chief of police. I know that personally because last year, my wife and I were profiled, racially profiled by the police, and we went public. We used our influence as residents of West Louisville to draw attention to the issue, not to ourselves, but to the issue, because it's important that Black leadership, or people who have influence and the platform, not be apathetic, but to help create empathy. And I did not get justice. And it is time for Chief Conrad to be fired. It's a matter of principle. It's a matter of justice. In addition to that, we want those persons responsible for the death of Saint Breonna Taylor to be prosecuted and charged with murder. It is justice. We want justice. If you want peace, you must allow for justice. In addition to that, you've already met with the traditional black leadership, and you already know who they are. I don't care who takes the football across the goal line, as long as our team wins. And unfortunately, my generation and many of the institutions that my generation has led has failed. There is time, it is long overdue for a new generation of leaders to be taken serious, and we should hear their voices, a new generation. And my generation should be advisors. We should use our wealth, our institutions, our resources. They should be able to use, for example, offices in this church and whatever we can to help Black Lives Matters, to help El Surge, to help the Root Cause Institute, to help organizations like Man Up and Black Butterfly and Play Cousins and Non. These new grassroots organizations, because those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And the reason why they're closest to the problem and can be closest to the solution is because, unlike so many black folk of my generations, we have joined with the Jeffersons, we've left JJ, and we've moved on up to the east side. Now, I'm not saying that just because you live in the east side that you don't care about things that are going on in the west side. I'm not saying that. I am saying to some degree there is a need for a new generation of leadership to emerge, to be empowered, to be at the table, helping to make decisions. And I pledge to you that I will do everything I can. I will use all of my resources and all of my influence to help a new generation of leaders emerge. If I were to give, in closing, one final word of caution, it would be this to this emerging generation of leaders. One, you have a unique justice claim as black people. Quit allowing people to call you people of color and minorities, because your justice claim is unique. You are the descendants of slaves, Jim Crowed, Jane Crow people. You're the only group that was brought to this country to work to make white people rich, and you were brought here against your will. And then after they fired you, because Lincoln did not free you, he fired you, you endured another 100 plus years of legal, constitutionally state-sanctioned segregation. This country owes you, and it is not charity. They're not doing you a favor. It is a debt that they owe you. So my advice to you is, do not let anyone else come in and take what is rightfully yours as a descendant of slaves and Jim and Jane Crow people. And also this, everybody who's marching with you is not necessarily really for you. Let me give you this little something that happened. It happens all the time, but let me give you this little anecdotal story. You perhaps have heard of a man named Charles Manson. And in 1968, Charles Manson had a little hippie commune, and he was anti-establishment. And he went into the homes, his followers, into the homes of some prominent people. One was named Sharon Tate, a beautiful actress, who, by the way, was, I think, 8 months pregnant. And he had his disciples to murder them in their own home in the Los Angeles, California area. But to cover up what he did, he wrote on the walls of the home where the murder took place words like pigs and cops, and to contemporize it, they wrote on the walls, Black Lives Matters. And the reason they did that was as a decoy. They did it to give the impression that it was black people who killed the people and not whites helter-skelter, not whites helter-skelter. It wasn't Charles Manson and I think Susan Atkins and some of these others who were his disciples. And there's a whole lot of folk who will throw rocks, be destructive, but to quote Stokely Carmichael, the real role that white allies should play is to go back to the white community and help white folk and the white establishment bring back stolen money to put back in your pocket to help repair you so that you, young person, can have your own home. So you, young person, can start your own business. So you, young person, can be the next David, Yaya, McAtee. Every business in West Louisville should be controlled and owned by black people. Now that sounds, well, wait a minute, that's not right. Well, go to other communities and see what you see in the other communities. We need to recognize that everybody who's marching with us is not necessarily really for us. It's dark right now, but this is not the first time it has been dark for Black America. It was dark when 19 of us got off that man of war ship, that Dutch ship, in 1619. It was dark. And it was dark after the Bacon's Rebellion, when the British came and artificially in 1676, it was dark when they created the white race and began to make black people the bottom caste. It was dark. It was dark during the Revolutionary War when black people were slaves, when George Washington had his slaves and Thomas Jefferson had his slaves. It was dark when Eli Whitney created that cotton gin and cotton became king and we became slaves. Slavery expanded. It was dark with the compromise of 1850. It was dark when Andrew Johnson became president and reversed everything Abraham Lincoln did. It was dark when Rutherford B. Hayes moved the troops out of the South and repealed Reconstruction. It was dark when Southern Baptists used their racist theology to justify why black people should be permanently the bottom caste. It was dark, I tell you, when we were the victims of lynching and the victims of convict leasing. It has always been dark. And segregation, it was dark. It has always been dark. When we were in inferior schools, when we were the back of the bus, there has not been a time when the masses, I'm not talking about the classes, I'm talking about the masses. Please don't confuse the classes with the masses. It has always been dark for black people. But I remember hearing Martin Luther King Jr. say that the stars are always out. It's light right now, and the stars are out right now. But you can't see the stars now while it's light, because the stars can only be seen in the dark. And I would submit to you that in this dark, dark moment in our history, in the midst of COVID that has been exacerbated by racial injustice, not only COVID-19, when black people are disproportionately the victims of COVID-19 because of the determinants of health, which is caused by the determinants of economic injustice. They're all connected together. As dark as it is, King said that you see the stars when it gets dark. And I believe that some stars are shining in the midst of this darkness. And can I tell you who the stars are that are shining? It is those of you, my brothers and sisters, my younger brothers and sisters in your generation. You are the stars in the darkness that is shining through your advocacy and your protest. And on behalf of my generation and the elders who came before you, we salute you. Thank you so very much for this opportunity.